Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're going to dive into something I think we've all thought about at some point. When do we actually become adults? We've got some YouTube videos, some social media posts.
It's amazing how much the idea of adulthood really changes between cultures and even just between people.
Yeah,
We're going to unpack all that today. The different viewpoints, those big milestones, responsibilities, and even those lines we draw that are kind of random.
right. One of the YouTube videos is a couple, Dan and Vanessa, talking about what makes someone an adult.
Okay.
Dan thinks financial independence is the main thing.
Yeah.
He specifically mentions being able to pay for your own place.
That's interesting how that brings up like the money side of being an adult.
Yeah.
Is it even possible to be independent in today's world without being stable financially?
Exactly. He even goes so far as to say, at any point, you can leave this house of your parents and live on your own, take care of yourself, and you're not dependent on somebody else. That's when you are an adult. But then he throws in that 16 should be like the ideal age for adulthood, but he admits that neither he nor society were ready for that at 16.
It's that tension between the ideal and what's real, right?
Yeah.
You might really want to be independent, but do you really have the money and the job skills to make it work?
Right?
That's something to think about. Are we pushing for adulthood too early, or are we holding it off too long in our current world?
It's true.
Yeah.
We're told 18 is that magic number, but are we really ready for all that comes with being an adult at that age?
That's a really good question.
Yeah.
It's different for everyone, isn't it?
Vanessa brings up something completely different,
Okay.
rites of passage.
Okay.
She compares how we don't have clear markers for it in American culture versus other countries where there are ceremonies or celebrations for becoming an adult.
Right.
What do you think about that? Could those rituals change how we see adulthood?
It makes you think, that's for sure. Even simple rituals can have a huge impact psychologically. They give you structure, a feeling of belonging, and a way to mark those changes. Think about graduation or weddings.
Right, yeah.
They're not just parties. There's society acknowledging a change in your status, right?
Yeah.
And they come with a whole bunch of expectations and support.
So in a way, maybe those rituals could act as a bridge between being a teenager and being an adult,
Yeah,
give you guidance and support from your community during that change.
exactly. They can give you a framework, like a set of shared expectations
Right.
that can be super valuable during a time that can feel really uncertain
Definitely.
and sometimes overwhelming.
Now, both Dan and Vanessa agree that having kids is a huge catalyst for becoming an adult,
Oh.
even if it doesn't apply to everyone.
Ah,
What do you make of that? Is it the ultimate responsibility that makes us grow up?
it's interesting how they describe it as being forced to confront adulthood.
Yeah.
Like suddenly, boom, you're responsible for another human being.
Yeah.
And that could totally change your perspective.
Yeah.
It's not about you anymore. It's about taking care of and teaching someone else.
They both admit they might have held onto some younger habits or mindsets longer if they hadn't had kids. So it seems like parenthood can speed up that shift to adulthood,
Yeah.
even if it's not always a welcome or easy change.
Yeah. And it connects back to what we were talking about with money.
Right.
Raising a child costs a lot,
Yeah.
and that can force people to become more financially independent, even if they weren't really ready for it.
You also included some social media posts in our research for this deep dive, and it's striking how some of them mirror what Dan and Vanessa talked about,
Right.
but they also give a wider range of perspectives. Some people online, like Dan, focus on external markers like your career and your finances as what defines adulthood.
It's interesting, though, how many others emphasize those changes that happen inside you, like making your own decisions, taking responsibility for your actions, and growing emotionally.
Right.
It really highlights that adulthood is subjective.
Yeah. And it makes you wonder, which is more important, the external achievements or that internal growth.
Yeah.
Are they both crucial for becoming a well-rounded adult?
It doesn't seem like it's one or the other.
Yeah.
Both the external stuff and the internal changes contribute to a complete sense of adulthood. It might be the balance between the two that really defines the transition.
Right.
You can hit certain milestones like getting a good job or buying a house, but if you haven't developed responsibility or self-awareness,
Yeah.
do those achievements really mean you're an adult?
That's a question worth thinking about for sure.
Yeah,
Maybe it is about finding that balance between outward accomplishments and inner growth.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Adulthood isn't like checking off boxes. It's a journey of constantly developing.
Right.
And it's a journey we all take differently depending on our own circumstances, personalities, and values.
And speaking of navigating, Dan and Vanessa have a pretty interesting debate about whether there even is a right age for adulthood.
Yeah.
Dan initially throws out 16, but then admits that society isn't really set up for that.
Which brings us back to that gap between the ideal and the real.
Right.
We might want independence early on, but the way society is structured,
Yeah.
like with education and jobs, it often doesn't match up with those ideals.
And Vanessa doesn't seem to think any particular age is the right one. She focuses more on personal growth as the deciding factor. She even says, I think it's more to do with making your own decisions.
It's like she's saying that adulthood is less about reaching a certain age and more about developing that ability to decide for yourself.
Right.
The ability to make choices, see the consequences, and take ownership of your life. Those are the signs of a mature person.
So maybe it's not about a fixed timeline, but about a gradual shift in how we think, how we decide things, and how we take responsibility for ourselves and what we do.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And that shift can happen at different speeds for everyone. It's a process of self-discovery, figuring out how to handle the world while staying true to our own values and what we want to achieve. And I think that's a really powerful way to think about adulthood.
Yeah.
It's not about fitting into a set of expectations, but about creating our own paths, learning from what we go through, and always trying to become more self-aware and responsible people.
I love that idea. Adulthood as a journey and not a destination.
Yeah.
It takes the pressure off of finding that one perfect moment where you magically become a grown-up.
Right.
It allows for individuality and acknowledges that we're all constantly changing and growing, no matter how old we are or where we are in life.
Absolutely. And I think this idea of a gradual transition is something we'll see in other parts of our conversation today as we dig deeper into what it really means to be an adult in the 21st century. As we've been talking about these different ideas of adulthood, I've noticed how much the concept is tied to communication.
Oh, for sure. We talked about those language learning resources, but even in those YouTube videos with Dan and Vanessa, just how they talk to each other,
Yeah.
Listen and disagree respectfully.
Right.
It all feels very adult, doesn't it?
It really does. Think about how they handle those tough conversations. Spending money. They regret work-life balance, even getting annoyed with each other's habits. That takes maturity and communication skills that we don't always see in younger people.
That's so true. It's like watching a masterclass in being an adult.
Yeah.
They're showing us how to say what you need, set boundaries, and work through disagreements without everything blowing up.
And remember when they talked about feeling overwhelmed at their first jobs?
Oh, yeah.
Those situations really test your communication.
For sure. Dan trying to keep up with the fast-paced kitchen talk. Vanessa not knowing how to answer questions about phone plans.
Right.
It forces you to adapt, learn quickly, and communicate even when you're not totally confident.
Those early work experiences can be brutal for learning how to communicate.
Yeah.
You're thrown right in, and you either sink or swim.
But then there are those moments where Dan and Vanessa are describing their passions and dreams.
Right.
Dan talking about his ideal game room, Vanessa outlining her vision for a home studio. Their language becomes so much richer and nuanced.
It's like they're using a whole different level of communication when they talk about things that really matter to them.
Totally. And it's not just about expressing your own thoughts and feelings, but also about really listening to what the other person is saying and responding to that.
Yeah.
Like their conversation about Thanksgiving, they're sharing a tradition, creating a connection that goes beyond just words.
Those shared rituals, the unspoken language of tradition and family, are a huge part of adulthood. It reminds us that being an adult isn't just about individual milestones.
Yeah.
It's about being part of something bigger than ourselves.
And even their different ways of relaxing say a lot.
Oh, yeah.
Dan needing to be active, Vanessa preferring those tech-free walks. It shows how important it is to understand your own communication style, even when it comes to self-care.
For sure. Knowing how you best recharge and communicate what you need is essential for staying balanced and healthy as an adult.
It feels like communication is woven through every part of being an adult.
Yeah.
It's how we connect, express ourselves, solve problems, and ultimately build a life that has meaning.
It's a tool, but it's also so much more than that.
Right.
It's fundamental to being human.
Yeah.
And like you said, it becomes even more important as we deal with the complexities of adulthood.
Speaking of tools, those language learning resources you found were really interesting. They break communication down into smaller steps, making it feel less overwhelming.
It's like they're taking the mystery out of it,
Right.
showing that anyone can learn to communicate well, no matter where they're starting.
And if we think about those resources alongside what we're talking about today,
Yeah.
we start to see how learning a new language and becoming an adult are similar.
Mm.
Both require you to get out of your comfort zone, tackle new challenges, and develop a deeper understanding of yourself and the world. It's more than just grammar and vocabulary. It's
Yeah.
about building those habits of mind, the curiosity, persistence, and resilience that you need to navigate adulthood successfully.
Exactly. And those funny skits about practical stuff,
Mm-hmm.
like ordering food or asking for directions,
I love those.
those are like cheat sheets for everyday adulting moments.
Uh,
Things that can sometimes be a bit scary.
it's so great how they use humor.
Yeah.
They remind us that being an adult doesn't have to be serious all the time.
That's so important to remember. We
Mm.
get so caught up in all the pressures that we forget to enjoy the journey,
Right.
to have a little fun along the way.
And that 2-hour English conversation marathon, talk about intense adulting practice.
Wow.
They covered everything from weekend plans to job experiences.
It highlights all those core areas of life that we're always dealing with as adults.
Uh-huh.
And by giving us the words and the confidence to talk about those topics,
Yeah.
it's empowering us to be more involved in those conversations.
They're not just giving us the tools to survive adulthood, but to actually thrive in it,
Right.
to connect with others, share our experiences, and build a life that feels real.
And as we look closer at these resources, we see another layer of insight into adulthood.
Yeah.
It's about embracing learning throughout life, expanding our horizons, and always challenging ourselves to grow.
I love that idea that becoming fluent in a new language is like the journey of adulthood.
Yeah.
It's all about embracing the unknown, pushing your limits, and finding new ways to express yourself.
It's not just a skill, it's a whole mindset,
Right.
an approach to life that values curiosity, adaptability,
Yeah.
and a willingness to step outside of what you're used to.
This deep dive is making me rethink my whole approach to learning and personal growth.
Me too.
I'm feeling inspired to take on new challenges, look for different perspectives, and never stop learning.
It's a powerful reminder that adulthood isn't a static state.
Uh-huh.
It's a dynamic process of becoming.
And these language learning resources are giving us a framework for that process,
Right.
equipping us with the tools to communicate, connect, and create a life that feels rich and fulfilling.
It's like they're saying, here's a map, a compass, and instructions for this exciting and unpredictable journey.
Yeah,
Now go out and explore.
I love that. Speaking of exploration, I noticed how Dan and Vanessa's conversations often go off on these unexpected tangents, like their interest in nature.
Oh, yes. Dan with his albatross, Vanessa and her mantis shrimp.
Right.
It reminds us that being an adult doesn't mean losing your sense of wonder.
Exactly. It's about holding on to that childlike curiosity and continuing to learn and explore throughout life.
And if we connect this back to communication, the thirst for knowledge makes you a more interesting and well-rounded communicator. The more you know, the more you have to share,
Right.
the more connections you can make.
I love how you're tying all these different threads together: communication, lifelong learning, personal growth.
Yeah.
It creates a much richer understanding of what it means to be an adult.
And let's not forget a key theme that came up in Dan and Vanessa's conversations, the importance of personal values and priorities.
You're talking about when they reflected on spending choices that didn't really match their values, right?
Exactly.
Like Dan's impulse buy of those expensive headphones and Vanessa's ongoing struggle with those Starbucks tea purchases.
Right.
It highlights how important it is to make conscious decisions about where you spend your time, money, and energy as an adult.
It's about finding that balance between enjoying the present moment and planning for the future,
Yeah,
between treating yourself and being responsible with your money.
right.
The constant learning process.
And it's something a lot of people struggle with. Even in those social media discussions, we saw the same back and forth.
Right.
Some people define adulthood by external achievements, the career, the house, the family,
Right.
while others focus on those internal shifts, taking responsibility, becoming more emotionally mature. It's like
Yeah.
everyone's trying to find their own balance point.
Yeah. It reminds us that there's no one definition of adulthood.
Hmm.
It's always changing, shaped by individual experiences, cultural norms, and personal values.
Yeah.
What one person sees as a clear sign of adulthood might mean very little to someone else.
So maybe it's less about checking things off a list
Yeah.
and more about finding that sense of balance inside yourself,
Yeah.
that feeling of being grounded and centered in your own life, no matter where you are on that journey.
I think you're right.
Yeah.
And as we've seen from those language learning resources,
Yeah.
There are tools and strategies we can use to develop that sense of balance in different areas of our lives.
Uh-huh.
They break down those complex adulting skills: communication, making decisions, setting priorities into manageable steps,
Right.
offering a way to master those essential life lessons.
I mean, it's like they're giving us a roadmap saying, hey, this adulting thing might seem complicated, but here are some practical tips and techniques to help you handle it with more confidence.
I think that's the key takeaway from this deep dive.
What is it?
Adulthood isn't about reaching a specific destination.
Hmm.
It's an ongoing journey of growth, learning, and adapting.
It's about embracing the challenges, celebrating the wins, and finding those moments of balance and joy in the middle of all the complexities of life.
Yeah.
It's about defining adulthood on your own terms and always trying to become the best version of yourself.
Beautifully said.
You know, as we've been talking about all these different sides of adulthood, I keep thinking about this idea of balance.
Uh-huh.
It feels like a recurring theme in everything we've discussed, right?
Yeah.
Whether it's about work-life balance, balancing personal freedom with responsibility, or even finding that middle ground between our youthful ideals and the actual reality of adult life.
It's like you said, trying to find that sweet spot
Well,
where
yeah.
you're handling your responsibilities,
Yeah.
going after your dreams, and taking care of your relationships
Yeah.
without getting completely burned out in the process.
Right. And it's interesting how different people approach finding that balance.
Oh, yeah.
Think about how Dan and Vanessa talked about relaxing. Okay. Dan needs that intense physical outlet to deal with stress, like playing sports,
Right.
while Vanessa finds peace through those walks without technology and prioritizing sleep.
Their approaches are totally different,
Yeah.
but they both want the same thing.
Yeah.
That feeling of balance and well-being. It reminds us that there's no one right way to achieve balance in our lives.
It really shows how important self-awareness is, doesn't it?
Absolutely.
Knowing what truly recharges you and being able to communicate those needs is so important,
Yeah.
especially as we're juggling more and more responsibilities.
It's a skill you often develop over time, through trying things out and making mistakes.
Right.
Remember how Dan and Vanessa talked about playing sports as kids?
Yeah.
Dan loved those structured team environments,
Right.
but Vanessa was more drawn to doing things on her own.
Yeah.
It's like they were already, even back then, figuring out how to balance their need for social interaction with their desire for independence.
It makes you wonder if those early experiences shape how we approach balance as adults.
Mm-hmm.
Maybe people who liked team sports end up in careers that value working together,
Right.
while those who preferred solo activities find fulfillment in more independent roles.
That's an interesting idea. It suggests that our understanding of balance could be a mix of our personality, our early experiences, and the environments we grow up in.
Their conversation about bad purchases also connects to this idea of balance.
Uh-huh.
Dan buying those expensive headphones on impulse, and Vanessa constantly struggling with buying tea at Starbucks.
It's about finding that middle ground, isn't it?
Yeah.
Between enjoying the moment and thinking about the future.
Right.
Between treating yourself and being financially responsible.
It's a constant learning curve for sure.
And it's something that seems to be a challenge for a lot of people.
Yeah.
Even in those online discussions, we saw that same debate.
All right.
Some people define adulthood by those achievements. You can see the career, the house, the family.
While others focus on those internal changes, like taking responsibility and becoming more emotionally mature,
Right.
it's like everyone's searching for their own equilibrium.
It just reinforces that there's no single definition of adulthood.
Yeah.
It's always changing, shaped by what we go through,
Yeah.
what our culture tells us, and what we value personally. So maybe it's less about checking things off a list and more about finding that balance within yourself.
Right.
That feeling of being grounded and sure of yourself in your life.
That feeling of knowing who you are and where you stand, no matter where you are in your journey.
Exactly. And like we saw with those language learning resources,
Yeah.
there are actual tools and strategies we can use to develop that sense of balance in different parts of our lives.
Those resources really break down those big adulting skills like communicating, making decisions, and prioritizing
Right.
into smaller steps.
Yeah.
It gives us a way to learn those essential life lessons. It's like they're saying, look, this adulting thing can seem complicated, but here are some tips and tricks to help you navigate it with more confidence.
I think that's the biggest takeaway from this deep dive. Adulthood isn't about reaching a specific destination.
It's more about the journey, right?
Exactly. It's an ongoing process of growing, learning, and adapting.
It's about embracing those challenges, celebrating the wins, and finding those moments of balance and joy amidst all the complexities of life.
And it's about figuring out what adulthood means to you.
Yeah.
and always trying to become the best version of yourself.
This has been a great discussion. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into adulthood.
Thanks for having me.
We'll see you next time for another exploration of fascinating and thought-provoking topics.